Hello and welcome to the 2020 Digital Foundry Graphics of the Year Awards discussion, whatever you want to call it. Just as we did last year, we're talking about the games that perhaps impressed us the most. But obviously, in the age of COVID, we cannot all be together. So for this one, I'm joined remotely by the one and only, the legendary Alyx Battaglia.
Thanks, John. Pretty crap year, but a good year for video game graphics, I would say. So what are you gonna do?
I would say you are absolutely right. But so basically the format for this video is pretty straightforward. We selected 9 games. I know it's a strange number, but we selected 9 games that we've kind of voted as our top 9. So we're gonna work our way up from number 9 all the way down to number 1. And then at the end of the video, we're also gonna throw in a few additional honorable mentions that maybe didn't quite make the list for any number of reasons, but we at least want to give a small shout out to. So with that in mind then, Alyx, shall we get to number 9?
Yeah, sure. I'll start this one off here.
Go for it.
Our number 9 choice for this year for best graphics will be Minecraft RTX, or Minecraft DXR, however you really want to call it. The new version of Minecraft released for Windows PC, DX12 version, utilizing path-traced graphics. And you know, this started off earlier in the year in a beta version that I covered with John back then, and we've also covered, you know, a path-traced mod for the Java version of Minecraft in the past. So this is very much so in that same vein. It only kind of goes to number 9 on our list here because, you know, it's a game that looks like Minecraft. You know, at the end, the tech is really cool driving it. You have this really systemic lighting system where you can, you know, almost make a game out of the lighting itself due to how, you know, every single object reacts differently to the light and it bounces everywhere. But, you know, it's, you know, 64 by 64 textures or 32 by 32 textures. It can only look so good in comparison to the other games we have on this list. But I was thoroughly impressed. I really liked the way this game looks.
I agree. I'm also very impressed with it. And obviously path tracing is kind of the holy grail for real-time rendering. So it's kind of nice to have sort of this first look at it. You know, obviously there's also Quake 2 RTX out there. Yes. And you kind of get the idea of that, yes, some of these more simplistic games are serving as demonstrations of path tracing. And that's for a good reason, because performing this complex operation in a higher fidelity game is extremely expensive. So, yeah. But we'll get there.
It's a glimpse of the future, essentially, and it also just really shows how important lighting is for game graphics in general. Minecraft looks, you know, it looks like a game that came out almost at the end of the 90s in certain ways in terms of its presentation. But when you just change the lighting formulas driving those graphics, it looks really, really modern. So
precisely,
this is a really good thing to talk about. Yeah.
So that's number 9. For number 8, then I'll tackle this one first. We went with Ori and the Will of the Wisps.
Yes.
And the reason for this is pretty simple, actually. It's one of the more impressive examples both of a 2D platforming game, technically, but also of a Unity game.
Yes.
Specifically. So obviously it did launch with a few minor issues with performance, but that has since been ironed out, and now it runs beautifully on every single platform, including the Switch, by the way, which is impressive to see. But so what I love about this is the way they've sort of fused this combination of 2D assets, all these individual layers, with 3D models. And the benefit of their layer system is actually the game has full depth information. So it knows what's behind each and every layer, which is actually a little bit more expensive for rendering. But this approach also means you can have things like perfect depth of field without any of the typical artifacts. They also developed this absolutely killer lighting feature, which is essentially like painted on dynamic lighting, where they painted different states, like, you know, light to the left, right, up, you know, head on kind of thing on these different textures and pieces of artwork to simulate a light, and then they sort of combine that with some other shader magic to create the illusion of a dynamic light moving across a painted surface, which gives it a look that's pretty unique, I'd say, right? It looks really good.
It's really great, and I also really love the fact that it is targeting extremely high refresh rates on, well, on PC, obviously, whatever you can really throw at it in terms of hardware, but on consoles, it's already targeting 60 FPS with this really cool fluid animation and high resolution. But you know, you go over to next-gen consoles and you have a 4K 120 mode, right, John? And you played that through, and 4K 120 HDR. There's not many launch games that can say they're pushing that. Yes, it's a 2D game, but when you see that all in motion at such a high fidelity, at such a high frame rate, you're not really thinking that the game's simply a 2D game anymore.
Exactly.
It looks special.
Exactly. And the HDR is also exceptional in this game. And just seeing it in motion, it really is, I think, one of the most beautiful games released in the last decade by far. It's just absolutely amazing. So those guys, we did that nice behind the scenes video, which really kind of helped gain appreciation for what they've pulled off here.
Yeah, really.
And yeah, like I said, they've really mastered Unity. I mean, obviously they've made a lot of changes to the core engine.
Yeah.
They've built their own tools and a lot of new pipelines to handle this sort of performance, but it really showcases what's possible with Unity in the right hands. So that's number 8 then.
I guess I'll start off with our number 7, but you actually covered this more than I did because I got sick. And this would be Doom Eternal from id Software, running across last-gen consoles all the way up to PC, and now just recently released on Switch, which we're gonna probably have a look at some point soon enough, maybe.
That's right.
This game is just really, I think, I don't know how to describe it. It reminds me of like arcade levels of perfection, of targeting 60 FPS and designing your entire game engine around that fact, and also going above and beyond the Call of Duty for, Doom 2016 already looked really good, I thought, when it came out. And I was surprised back then that it was pushing 60 so well on consoles. And, Doom Eternal comes along, pushes out the amount of geometry rendering on screen, ups the level of effects that you're seeing constantly in terms of particles. And I think the art design is also just really, really well done.
And part of that as well is they ditched all remnants of mega texture, which had still been hanging around in id Tech 6. id Tech 7 completely eliminates this, allowing, for what I believe are the more effective approach to textures, allowing them for much granular detail on the materials and such. And you can really feel it in this. Just the quality, they've not only pushed out texture detail, but as you say, like the geometry, the meshes they use are so much more dense. I mean, they had already done a lot of optimizations to get there with the Wolfenstein games. But Doom Eternal goes even further with this. So, but despite all that, like you said, the focus is on targeting 60 frames per second minimum except for on Switch, and there's a good reason for that.
Yeah, of course.
But so it really shows what's possible when you really so carefully architect an engine with this high performance target in mind. And every design decision they made was done so with this as the goal. And when you look at it, it's just one of the best looking games out there in terms of just pushing so much detail at a high frame rate. Oh, and we didn't even touch on the animation.
Yeah, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's they go for a less realistic style of animation. They really allow the artists and the animators to sort of really get into it. So everything feels exaggerated. And when you combine that with the motion blur, it just has this striking appearance to it in motion.
Yeah, I always loved the way the imps animate specifically, because they get onto walls and they throw fireballs at you while moving at the same time, while tracking your position. I always thought that was really well done and something not a lot of people talked about when even 2016 came out. And here it's just another level of that. One thing I can't wait to see based upon id Tech 7's development so far is they announced, oh my gosh, it has to be quite a while now that they announced ray tracing support at some point in time in the future. I don't know what the Corona crisis did to that pledge of support for ray tracing, but I imagine id Tech, they're going to do something really interesting with ray tracing whenever they get their time and hands-on with it.
When I talked to them earlier this year, they hadn't even started on it yet. So there is no information on that as far as I know, and they haven't shared anything yet. So I assume someone somewhere is tinkering in the background. but for now, they've really focused on hitting high frame rates on the PC. And, obviously running on an RTX 3090, a fair bit more powerful than a console. I was able to run at 160 frames per second locked on my monitor.
Yeah, which is near 4K on your monitor, which is
amazing. It's 3840 by 1600, and it's so buttery smooth. Getting a game that looks this good running at that high of a frame rate is not a common thing. So I really respect this drive to just push performance while still offering exceptional visual quality.
Yeah, it's like, this is a game that scales so well on the CPU too. I'm just thinking about it, like all those articles about trying to push the game up to near 1000 FPS at like the lowest resolution. Even you in your video pushed it up to like in the 500s.
Yeah, exactly.
At like a low resolution, I remember that. That was so good.
They also embraced Vulkan, which is something I think I'd like to commend. Again, another large budget, big game releasing with the Vulkan API powering it on the PC. I love to see it.
So this next one, I guess, is one that you covered, right, John, more recently?
Yeah, that's right. So next on our list, actually, number 6 is Demon Souls by Bluepoint Games. It's basically a remake of the From Software original on PlayStation 3. Bluepoint has always done an exceptional job, I think, with sort of revamping classic games.
Oh yeah.
They've kind of made that their mission. I guess the company sort of founded on this is like one of the top studios for delivering a new version of a classic game. But typically they in the past they had mostly focused on just up-resing things, improving the assets, just doing just enough where it still looked like the original game, but it looked and ran smoother. But starting with Shadow of the Colossus a few years ago, they basically swapped over to doing like full-on remakes, if you will, where every piece of the game is touched, every asset rebuilt from scratch. And I think Demon Souls is perhaps their most impressive release yet.
I'd agree, 100%. One thing I really like about kind of looking at Shadow of the Colossus remake as well as this is kind of, I think their animation is really well done. On top of like the environmental design, they've really embraced most recently in Demon Souls, using tessellation for the environment in both modes, the performance and the quality mode. And it just shows how for, I think under the previous generation of consoles, that amount of tessellation they're using would not really be tenable, especially at the higher resolutions they're pushing and the frame rates they're pushing up to 60 FPS. And it's just one of those games as a launch game that shows like, this is what the new generation does. It can power this amount of like the way the environments look, and also the loading, how you kind of just go from one area to the next without even a thought. That if you go look at other From Software games on consoles before this, it's kind of disastrous how long you would have to wait after you die. It changes the game. It makes it much more enjoyable on the console side, definitely. So
it does, and you're right. The tessellation approach is really interesting because, I mean, typically a lot of games push towards really leaning heavily on normal maps and very obvious static mesh designs. It's very standard stuff, but tessellation has been around for a long time, really. The idea is just to create a more dense model in a more dynamic way. It's programmatically generated rather than arted up that way. That's kind of the difference. And it really allows for that granular polygon detail. I even prefer it, obviously to something like parallax occlusion mapping as well, because it's actual real depth. And alongside the depth, another thing that they really excel at with Demon Souls is the sort of the contact shadows and the ambient shadowing. And this is, so they use a screen space solution for this, combined with other shadow mapping techniques. But they found a way to essentially allow all of the tessellated geometry to cast very natural looking, very rich shadows as you move around, because the player has a light source attached to them, like prior Souls games, but this time it's an actual shadow casting light source, which is basically enables some very dramatic lighting that, I kind of feel like From had wanted to do this in the past. Like you look at Dark Souls 2, the reveal where they had the torch casting shadows, but we never really saw them move in this full direction where you have dynamic lights. Every dynamic light can cast shadows, and that's exactly what Bluepoint has done with the Demon Souls remake.
It really shows how even with, usually there's a great compromise between games that use real-time lighting and those that don't in terms of visuals. And I think that's one thing I've always struggled with in the past. That's why Dark Souls 2 got its downgrade, because they moved from real-time lighting to a more static approach. And here, once again, I think this is really only possible on the next generation of consoles at the fidelity and frame rate they're pushing. Fully real-time lighting, that's awesome. I respect that.
And at 60 frames per second, no less.
Yeah.
It's a great way to start the generation for sure, and they did an awesome job there.
So as much as I want to start the next game, John, I have so little experience with this game directly that you really need to take the helm here. So please introduce.
Sure. So after this one, for number 5, we're going with The Last of Us Part 2. And I feel that Naughty Dog's approach to visual design has always been top tier. But in this case, so obviously the world of The Last of Us is sort of that dystopian sort of future, well, not even future, but you know, it's normal city environments, places that you might be familiar with, but because of the apocalyptic events that have occurred, electric lights are rare. And as a result, they really had to focus on ambient indirect lighting, which obviously in real-time graphics is one of the most difficult things to get right. But in this case, they opted for primarily a baked solution.
Yeah.
Which sounds not exciting in that sense, but what they've done with the quality of the materials work and the artistry of the lighting itself, combined with just the fidelity and granularity of the environments and you know, the lighting and shadowing that is present as well, not to mention the character models and animation work, it comes together in a way that's just extremely impressive to behold, especially given the scale and the size of the environments now.
Yeah, they're much bigger
compared to the original. And animation, of course, I mentioned that. That's a key thing. They are embracing motion matching, which I think Ubisoft pioneered in For Honor. And essentially, it's like pouring all of your different animation sequences into a bucket. You know, you can capture like a long animation using motion capture and actually sort of pull from that animation string and sort of dynamically string together all these complex animations that all blend together in a very natural way. So it's not just about like, okay, we're going to play animation A and B and we have to blend them together. It's a much more robust and complex solution, but it allows for much greater sort of variation and granularity in every single movement. And you really feel it here because a lot of the actions you perform are sort of influenced by what's happening. You know, if you bring out your weapon to shoot and you dive, or you throw a brick and you go after an enemy, but then you get hit by someone else, the game's able to transition between each motion state in such a natural way that it all feels like one seamless animation.
That's really impressive. I also kind of want to praise what I'll call just tech art in general in Naughty Dog games, where I saw a great example of a rope you can carry in the game that has like proper constraints around, like when you move it through different objects and things like that. There's a great attention to detail to make sure that if they do build in a gameplay piece that requires some technology behind it, whether it be physics or the way the shading looks, that they always make sure that it doesn't look awkward. You know,
That's right.
Something where like you would think a game, you know, like due to the constraints of development, that every single part of a Naughty Dog game usually tends to feel extremely polished. And that's something I'd really want to praise. And that means obviously a lot of hard work and probably a lot of overtime in the studio and you know, a lot of dedication. So
yeah, no doubt.
The workers themselves deserve a lot of praise there, as much as you can give them.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's so much bespoke attention to detail across the game, where it's not just about crafting all these unique systems together, but they make sure that every single moment feels like it's its own set piece, right? There's just so much attention to detail there. And I can only imagine the amount of man hours required to create something at this fidelity. It's really just, it's really unbelievable. And it all feels so custom. Like it doesn't feel like an open world where they used, you know, not to say, obviously building an open world, you know, you're hand placing a lot of stuff, but there's also procedural elements and various other techniques to sort of speed up world generation. Where here, it just feels so carefully crafted, like every inch of the game and every action that can be performed. It's really impressive to see. And considering the length of the game, which is like 25 hours the first time through, that they had to keep it up for that amount of time is incredible. And that's not even, we didn't even touch on the cutscenes, where they've gone completely real time. They did this with Uncharted 4 as well, but all the cutscenes was saved for maybe one or two, but I'm pretty sure they all are real-time cutscenes, and this includes just some amazing set-piece moments and just gorgeous sequences with extremely complex animation and camera work, and it's the kind of stuff you expect to see pre-rendered normally, but they don't go for it. They go all the way and just do it all in real time.
Something I vastly prefer, and it also, in the eventuality of some sort of PS5 backwards compat or re-release, and those real-time cutscenes are only just going to look better, which I really like. But as you were mentioning before, this level of bespoke attention to detail where every inch of the game world feels, like it was lovingly crafted. I'd say that goes for Half-Life Alyx, our next game on this list. Yeah, this one though is obviously different because it's experienced directly in VR, and our capture of this game can only represent that so well. But when you go through the game world of Half-Life Alyx, it's crafted very much so like I would say The Last of Us Part 2 is, where they focused really a lot on pushing extremely small fidelity. The fidelity of the objects in this game is absurd when you pick up anything from a bottle to looking at your hands or a handgun or just a random object in the environment, because you can interact with so much of this environment here. But they also pushed for an insane level of fidelity in the lighting, which, like The Last of Us 2, uses primarily purely baked lighting system. And you'll go into an area and you'll see like the sun bounce off of the side of a building, casting indirect shadows on like the tiniest little concrete details in the ground in front of you.
See, I'm glad you're highlighting this, Alex, because I think it really needs to be stressed that when we say something like lighting is baked, it's not a knock on it.
Yeah.
There's a tremendous amount of artistry that has to go into creating this lighting. So it's just a different approach to it. Obviously less dynamic, but not every game needs to be completely dynamic in this sense. And you can really just see the way that every single environment in this game is lit is just unbelievably realistic. And it's something that has to happen because when you play in VR, you can get your face up close to things and examine things from angles that you normally wouldn't see in a game played on a television display or a monitor.
And I want to say I was so impressed by this game, even though I felt incredibly ill while playing it. Not because of the VR, but I was sick at the time. And I was sitting down and I was still having so much fun, investing myself in the systems. And I spent so much time just peeking my face right next up to objects, like the graphics card on the table that you talked about in your video, John.
The Voodoo card, yeah.
The Voodoo card. Or I also think the character rendering technology, in terms of the combat AI and as well as the people you look at, like Russell, I love those character models. Eli, the Vortigaunt you meet with like the missing brain or whatever. Everything looks so good. I really love the way Half-Life Alyx looks, even though I really wish they keep pushing for VR because we need really great looking AAA-like experiences in VR. I do want to see what Source 2 can do in a traditional flat panel style game because it looks and runs pretty awesome in VR. What will it look like in a just like normal screen? Should be interesting to see.
Yeah, I guess that's the caveat, is that they have to target high frame rates on a wide range of hardware because you need that high frame rate for VR to function. And thus, there is some constraints there. I'm sure that they had to consider this when developing the game, of course. But still, and beyond the visuals, I also think it's worth just highlighting just the remarkable interactions available to the player and the way that so many elements sort of come together. Now, it's not as physics driven as Boneworks, which I've mentioned out, but the fidelity of these interactions is what's key. Like when you smash a window with your fist and sort of clear out the glass with your pistol just to get a better shot at the enemies and stuff like that. Like these are actions that I was going to say that you might perform in real life, but I don't think I'd be smashing any windows with my pistol, but
let's hope you're not doing this ever.
The idea is that you're interacting with the world in a way that feels more natural than you would in a typical game, where it's actually like, all right, I'm gonna collide my fist with this pane of glass in order to facilitate firing at enemies. So it just feels great to do that. You mentioned, sorry, I did mention animation really quickly, but this is another game that's also using motion matching, at least for the Combine AI, from what I read online. And it also just shows off the kind of dynamism that can be produced when you are playing the game, where the enemy needs to be, I would say, even more reactive
than a normal 2D, 2D flat panel game, because you can see the cracks so much more easily in VR, like the changes of animation states.
That's the most important thing right there. Is it's when you're in VR, you can notice the imperfections so much more clearly. To pull off this level of immersion with this level of quality in VR, it's such a huge task, and I really think Valve did a phenomenal job. But the next game, number 3, is one I've only played a little bit of, but you spent a lot of time with this one, and I think we can both agree that this one is absolutely amazing. I'm talking about Microsoft Flight Sim. Alyx, tell us about this one.
Microsoft Flight Sim embraces the tradition of the Flight Sim games, which haven't existed for, at this point in time until Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, for more than 10 years. Those games always pushed the graphical boundaries on PC and the simulation boundaries, and we're always crazy CPU heavy games.
Oh yeah.
And then, Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 comes out and pushes it even further. The level of detail on the planes themselves is, something like I've seen in Star Citizen, an equivalent level of where they just really want to make sure it makes it look and feel like you're in a cockpit. And then you look outside the cockpit, and the world somehow manages to be even more believable than the cockpit itself. The cloud rendering technology and the sky rendering technology they've developed for this game they're second to none, essentially. There's nothing that's ever looked better than this.
Yeah, the sky technology I think is perhaps the biggest highlight for me. They've really simulated the way light photons penetrate clouds and the different cloud formations and densities of cloud based on, weather patterns. All this physics stuff is simulated here in the clouds themselves, and they're fully volumetric and 3-dimensional as you fly through them. It's absolutely unreal.
Yeah, and then another thing to praise, of course, too, is you're flying essentially along 1-to-1 sized Earth in this game that's built using kind of the AI technologies in the cloud from Microsoft here to
the cloud.
I would say, the cloud. Build prefab, power the cloud. The prefabbed versions of the world where they fabricated distinct buildings, and then the cloud AI algorithm in the back end will populate it in front of you or all across the world, through a seed. For being AI driven primarily, they do have some areas that they come in with artists and touch them up, but even the AI generated areas of the world are scarily real.
Yeah, I think they've accomplished the dream. Ever since Flight Sim was introduced back in the 80s, I guess, the model of creating a Flight Sim world has always been okay, here's this terrain or even just a flat surface with a texture representing sort of the world. But this is the first time where I feel that they've really accurately represented actual places and buildings and structures in a way that looks believable to the eye. And like you say, if you look too closely, you can start to pick it apart. But by and large, when you're flying in that game, it can almost be mistaken for photorealism.
Yeah, I like the anecdote of Phil Spencer coming to see this game in development at Asobo Studios, because Asobo Studios made this game. They also made Plague Tale Innocence, another really wonderful looking custom engine game. And Phil Spencer's okay, so when are we going to see the game? And he thought he was seeing just normal kind of B-roll reels from real flights across the Earth. That says a lot. This is one of those games where if you just look at it from the side of your eye, it looks like real life.
It does.
That's amazing.
I agree.
And it's only going to get better looking. They're going to add ray tracing over time, greater VR support, even better graphics.
So yeah, this absolutely amazing looking game. But you know what else is amazing? The Amazing Spider-Man.
Or Marvel.
That's right. Yeah. So yes, number 2 is actually Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. And I think we both agreed on this one at number 2. It's one of the
we did.
few console games I think that you've kind of looked at and be like, okay, I like what they're doing here. And for good reason. I mean, obviously this is derived from their last generation 2018 game, but especially after looking at the remaster, I see that they did a lot of work in this game. But the key feature here for us, I think, is real-time ray traced reflections on a very large scale.
Yeah. There's so much to be said about that. One launch game, it launched with the PlayStation 5, and as a result of the Corona crisis here, the amount of actual dedicated development that could happen in the same way that would happen in a studio is less, and they still managed to pull that off at 30 frames per second or even with the recently released mode that they added, the performance mode, 60 frames per second in open world game. And ray tracing isn't just done something that's purely running on the GPU or the graphics card inside a console. It has extremely high CPU requirements because there's a version of the scene being built up in the background and being prepared and sorted through on the CPU as well. And doing that in an open world game, which is probably already heavy on the CPU, even in these new consoles, that probably wasn't easy and required them, I would imagine, to restructure parts of their engine to even let it work properly at 30, let alone 60 hertz. And I think the reflections for what we've seen even in the PC space, these are really well done. Yeah, there's compromises, but when you're swinging through the city at 30 or 60 FPS, they're convincing enough, and they go so far out into the distance, which is really, really important.
Yeah, that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
They trace all the way out to the horizon. So it gets the clouds, the distant cityscape, and that's really important for the scale. And on top of that, they also render the shadow maps inside there. So you get that extra depth that could be missing otherwise. I guess the only thing that's really still missing, and it doesn't have a huge impact, but it would be nice, is they don't have secondary reflections.
Yeah.
Like normally you could just use like cube maps or something in there to sort of simulate, basically if you have like reflection of a glass building inside of a glass building, you should see another reflection on the glass reflected in the glass.
Yeah, right.
But it's just sort of blacked out. But the truth is, even when looking for this, in most cases, is actually difficult to tell unless you find a building where like the angles are such that you really see the glass reflected in the glass, and then you're like, oh, okay, there's no secondary reflection there. But I think that's a fair trade-off considering the benefits of the real-time ray tracing.
Yeah, and this is just their first outing as well, and a launch title. I imagine when they bring out their next games, whether that be the next Ratchet and Clank game, that we're going to see them pushing this ray tracing technology even further. And, I also really want to praise they didn't have to do this. They could have, just like left the game as is, but they also went into the cutscenes and, changed a lot of things for the remastering, and for Miles Morales as well, too. They introduced a strand hair model,
yes,
which really benefits the game's hair rendering. It's always like, we've had really good geometry on faces in games for a while, but hair is always that one area where I would say 90 to 95% of last gen games where it's like, oh man, that guy's nose and eyes, they look pretty convincing, but then you get to the hair and it's like, well, we can only do so much.
Even better there, it's like they actually have different types of hair well represented in the game.
Yeah, right.
So there's a wide range of people of different cultures and backgrounds in the game, and getting all those types of hair to look correct is no small task, I think, and they really improved. They really did a great job here.
Yeah, that's a lot of tech artist time and a lot of GPU programmers wondering, how do I make this hair look curly? which is probably not something. It's not intuitive at all. You have to read up a lot on it. So that's good. It's awesome stuff, and I think this is an amazing looking game.
So overall, it's a fantastic looking package, and it's a very promising start for the generation. That shows that real-time ray tracing like this is indeed possible on consoles, even on a large scale. And I think that's good for everyone, to be honest.
It's really good.
Especially because that can be somewhat scalable. So in a multi-platform game, you make the right nips and tucks on the console side, but you can still push it out further on the PC and improve the granularity. So it kind of benefits everyone. So this is good.
Yeah, and as much as I don't imagine this will happen anytime soon, but we've seen Horizon on PC. This game and this engine, I would love to see it once again back on PC, whenever. But that's me port begging. Let's leave that as is.
Well, we did see Sunset Overdrive on PC, and Insomniac released some VR titles as well.
Yeah, that's true. You never know.
The engine has been on the PC, maybe someday.
Maybe someday.
Okay, Alex, this is number one, right?
Yeah.
We're getting to number one. And this one has some caveats that we'll discuss, but I still think we both agree that this has earned its number one spot despite that.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say it. Number one for us is Cyberpunk 2077, specifically running on the PC.
On a high-end graphics card.
On a high-end modern graphics
Medium
card.
high.
Medium high, anything that supports ray tracing, I would say. You're going to get a great experience. God, where to start here? I guess going a little bit back to where we were talking about Miles Morales, where an open world game, there's a lot of things that go into making an open world game believable looking. It's the AI systems behind the scene is one thing, but also in terms of rendering tech, a city is living, breathing. The time of day is probably changing in a lot of these games, and getting that to look right, as well as having, I guess I would say, a level of artistry with the materials in the game too.
Yeah.
It's not at all to get a real-time time of day looking okay in the first place, and then also have all these kind of futuristic metals everywhere and a lot of attention to detail in each and every object you interact with, like in, The Last of Us Part 2 or Half-Life Alyx. This game is just pushing a crazy scale and level of detail that, you saw it a couple of years ago, John, and you were just wondering, like, gosh, how is this ever coming out anytime soon? How is this going to run on consoles at all? We have our answers to that now.
Yeah,
but I've come away just from looking at the PC version, both on medium level hardware as well as on the ultra high end, and I'm blown away. It's an amazing looking game.
Yeah, like obviously you're right. There's just the scale and level of detail and granularity and everything. The remarkable materials that they crafted here. Mm-hmm. We got some serious substance designer ninjas
Yes.
over there doing this work. It's impressive stuff. But I think, the thing that really sort of clinches it all for us is the extremely robust implementation of ray tracing that not only does reflections, not only does shadows, but it does like real world lighting all the way up to full global illumination.
Yeah.
If you want to go with the psycho option.
Yeah, it's pushing. It's going to scale so amazingly in the future, it's a PC game through and through, and that's why it probably is the way it is on other platforms, where they focused really hard on just pushing as much as they can onto that PC version. And it's like a game of old,
They're traditionally a PC developer.
Yeah, right.
And you can definitely tell. I mean, when The Witcher 2 launched, it was absolutely melting PCs.
Yes.
When The Witcher 3 launched, you actually could feel some compromises made for consoles, I felt.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And they took flack for it, if you recall.
Completely.
It fell short of that original reveal trailer. This, to me, actually feels like a response to that, where they're like, okay, we're not doing that again. And in fact, in terms of just fidelity, they haven't, because if you go back to the 2018 footage, the final game is significantly more impressive.
Yes, right.
Which is unusual. But obviously, this is a weird one because the console versions and even on PC, the game has issues, legendary issues, especially on console. I mean, it's one of the most bizarre releases I've ever seen, where you have both the most impressive looking game I maybe have ever seen running on a PC on one end, and then you have like something that should never have been released on the low end. It's really a Jekyll and Hyde kind of situation here.
We were wondering back in the day how this would ever run on consoles at all. And I just think maybe in the end, they should have probably left the last gen versions alone and probably shown them off at least beforehand too, so that people knew what they were getting into at least. And that's a really important thing to talk about. So much can be said about that, which we'll maybe talk about in some other content in the future at some point, who knows. But at least on the PC side of things, if you have a modern PC, I would say with like an 8-core, 6-core, 12-thread processor, anything from an RTX 2060 and up, you're going to be having a really good experience if you go into those settings and make sure you're turning on and turning off the right thing, because this is one of those games where you can just turn everything up and your computer will just explode.
Yeah, like I'm still laughing at how if you just use screen space reflections at the highest setting, it's nearly as expensive as ray traced reflections.
Yeah, that's absurd.
Which is absurd. And if you didn't realize this, you might be losing a ton of performance. Otherwise, you should just be using ray trace reflections anyway. Honestly.
There's so much to be said about this game. It's just really good looking. I do find it extremely unfortunate that the last gen versions came out in the way they did, and I understand the animosity completely.
No, I get it. I understand. I wouldn't be happy with this either if that was the way I was playing it. It does feel... Yeah, it's such a strange situation. I will say the performance is not acceptable by any means, but people acting like this is some out of the blue, we've never seen performance like this before, it's a little bit wrong, because this was actually not uncommon on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360.
Yeah, right.
This kind of like sub 20 performance in large open areas. It happened a lot more than you'd expect, and even still, like, again, very different time period, but it's funny in hindsight. At least like 50% of the N64 library runs like this or worse.
Worse, yeah.
That doesn't make it acceptable. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
People love GoldenEye, man. GoldenEye runs a lot worse than Cyberpunk does on an Xbox One.
Yeah.
I'll just tell you that right now. It actually does.
That's so good.
But it doesn't matter. Those versions are not good right now, but the PC version is absolutely stunning. No question.
I'll also throw out there that I think the GeForce Now version, the Stadia version, and the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S versions are all good. Why? They have really good CPUs, all these platforms.
That's true.
And that's what this game really hungers
for.
You know?
Series X in particular, in the quality mode, it gets like around 1800p kind of range often enough. Yeah. And it has the higher crowd density, and it can lock to 30 pretty much consistently. So, and the SSD also kind of solves a lot of the loading issues. So you still get the bugs, but the game feels significantly more polished and solid on that system. And there's other platforms. Yeah. But so yeah, it's a weird one. Like, it's a bittersweet one. Like, this is taking our #1 spot for the most impressive visuals of the year, and I stand by that. I think you do too.
Yeah, totally.
But it's very specific to very specific versions of the game, because there are a lot of problems with this one. That just makes things very tricky, but I can't take away from the amazing visuals on display.
Yeah, a lot of really good work from the team there. I guess Cyberpunk's out of the way. We should probably start talking now about our honorable mentions. These are games that we think look really good, but for one reason or another, or just happenstance, maybe they just don't make it on the list.
And this will be a quick little section, kind of a rundown here.
Would you want to start with alternative rendering games? I think I'd love to start with what I covered earlier in this year on PlayStation 4 Pro and partially on PlayStation 4, and that is Dreams from Media Molecule. Dreams is alternative rendering in the fact that video game graphics are typically made up of triangles, and exclusively triangles. Tiny little bits that are rendered on the GPU using specific hardware units on the GPU. Dreams, for the most part, forgoes all of that. And, everything's made of a very specific style of ray-marched rendering, like with hulls and all these, splatted things, very complex technical things. But in the end, it's for driving the normal way game graphics are created, like a model of a character. It requires a lot of very specific steps and separate programs and things like that, and it's not very intuitive for your average person. The way Dreams is set up is to do this in a way that's like playing with clay or playing with some sort of sculpting tools that you're used to. It's intuitive, and it's driven by the way the game does its rendering, and it's so unique and so interesting. And it looks really, really good while doing it.
Yeah, this probably could have been on the main list as well, and it's probably the best of the honorable mentions. Another one worth mentioning, though, I haven't actually gotten a chance to play this yet, but I was really impressed with your video. That's Teardown, which, again, it's all like voxelized sort of structures, and that's fully deformable, and it has physical properties on it, so like a physics simulation. So if you take out something, it'll like actually collapse in on itself.
Yeah, I think we saw not too often on this current generation of consoles, due to the more lackluster upgrade in on the CPU side of things, like with the Jaguar cores. And it was just really neat to see a daring game that was a pet project of a single person. Accidentally, Tuxedo Labs is just one person as far as I know. Very friendly person also too. I had a little bit of discussion with them. Really cool exotic rendering, and I don't know what it's going to mean in the future. Like both Dreams and Teardown, they're exotic rendering. They use pure compute paths for the most part for a lot of things. Is this the future of rendering? I don't know, but it would be really great to see more games that push in this direction, just because it looks cool too.
Yeah, I guess a couple years ago I also looked at Claybook, which used SDFs to do some crazy stuff. So yeah, I love this kind of stuff. Some other games on the list, though, just to quickly mention, I do think Final Fantasy VII Remake is an absolutely gorgeous game, but the only reason it kind of falls short is because it does have a number of technical issues and limitations with texture pop-in and some weird low-quality assets. So like you have some of the finest real-time rendering I've seen this generation mixed with some really weird, puzzling technical limitations. So
it's so close. There's I love the cutscenes in the game. I really do love the cutscenes. They're really, really well done. And I like a lot of the industrial areas, for example, in the opening chapter.
Yeah.
Then it just kind of falls apart towards the end of the game, oddly enough, when you get to the scrap yards and stuff.
It weaves in and out depending on where you go.
Yeah. I would really love to see what happens with this game and tech when it comes to PlayStation 5 and PC in the future, because I do wonder how many of these limitations were just because of the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro.
I'm sure plenty of them are.
Is there a really good looking garbage asset or door on the PlayStation 5 version? I need to know, Square Enix.
Oh yeah,
Please.
The door. Yeah.
But yeah,
oh boy.
Final Fantasy 7.
Another one worth mentioning, I think, is Call of Duty Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. I can't wait for the sequel to that. This one I think gets the mention just because, yes, this also has some bugs and some crashing, but visually, I like that they're pushing ray trace shadows at 60 frames per second as well as 120 hertz, even in the visually striking campaign.
It's really great, and PC, you can push that up. It has like ray traced AO as well too, and
yeah, exactly.
It's just really well running game, I would say, on average on consoles when I covered. Looking at ray trace graphics in the PlayStation 5 version.
For sure.
Another thing I really think is with those ray trace shadows, I think it was in a presentation from Remedy when they were talking about introducing ray trace to Control or their engine Northlight. And they mentioned, ray trace shadows shows you how much detail we have in our worlds that is just lost with traditional shadow map techniques. And I was like, wow, when I played through Black Ops Cold War, there's so many little tiny parts of the environment that they just kind of become a little bit flat without those ray trace shadows, and you don't notice them. And ray trace shadows really brought back in those tiny little gubbins details that you can see in it.
I agree. Definitely a nice looking game.
The last game is one I didn't cover personally, but John had a lot more time with, and that is Sucker Punch's Ghost of Tsushima, which is PlayStation 4, PS5 title now, right, John?
Yeah, the PS5 version specifically is impressive as it runs in the high resolution mode at 60 frames per second now. So this one's interesting. The reason I didn't put this on the main list is there are some, I guess you could say, limitations with some of the animations, and there's a few things about it that I don't love, but the actual world rendering that they've done here, the sense of scale, their foliage system.
Foliage is great.
Which isn't just a bunch of, flat textures thrown together. It actually real 3D grass that you could sort of has nice physics interactions with the player model. And it's just, you combine that world density and the quality of the foliage and the leaf system with their very, very dramatic lighting and the cloud system, and it just has this unbelievably impressive look to it as you explore the world.
One thing I also want to point out is for Infamous Second Son, and I forget the name of the expansion pack for that, unfortunately.
First Light, thank
you, John. They really pushed a pipeline for their artists to make GPU particles useful. Usually in the past, GPU particles were they looked a little tacked on, a little bit just a bunch of floating particles in the air. And with the Infamous Second Son, it was a whole, range of different things that looked like really fantastical effects that, I don't know, they conformed to the game world so well. And in this version of their engine in Ghost of Tsushima, they also did it for the what are they called? The cherry blossom petals. Cherry blossom petals going through the air that you can step around in, and the leaves on the ground, which I'm pretty sure are a GPU particle system. And it looks really good. I think it's excellent usage of GPU particles.
It reacts to the animation and the momentum as well.
Yeah,
so,
right?
Everything sort of swirls around and moves. So as you're fighting, the leaves are flowing around you and moving as you slice your sword. It's all very impressive stuff.
It's great.
But yeah, it's just some of the character stuff and some of the the way the characters sort of place their feet on the terrain, I've seen better, but it's still overall absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, this could have, like we said, also could have easily been on the list, I think, in a lot of ways. Yeah.
And then there is actually one more I want to give a quick shout out to, and that's Doom 64. This is not a game where you look at, wow, this is incredible. It's more that I want to compliment the team behind this for just the attention to detail that they poured into ensuring that a Nintendo 64 era game is presented in such an accurate yet enhanced way. Right down to the triple point texture filtering that the N64 does, instead of using 4 samples on basically every other piece of hardware that supports texture filtering.
These people making this game really get it. When I mentioned it a little bit in my Game of the Year video that will be coming out, where there's remastering and remake efforts that kind of just miss the point a little bit about nostalgia, or miss the point a little bit about attention to detail. Some aspects of other games have that problem. But here, you know, making sure that, silly as it is, making sure the textures look right from an N64 game, that's really important for preserving the way the game looks while also enhancing it. You know, preservation of games is really important. And it's, you know, in the move to the digital era, it's always something that's really, you get a little nervous about, but you know, even though this is a digital release, it's pushing on all cylinders to make sure that this is the best version of the game, and it also looks like it should have looked like. There's no problems.
There's also a lot of adjustable options as well. It's 4K 60 on some of the consoles and 60 frames per second on every single platform.
Good stuff.
It uses, I think it uses Vulkan on the PC,
Yeah,
which is nice. I mean, just everything about it is just, it just says like, okay, these guys really care. There's a lot of attention to detail poured into it. My hat is off to Night Dive for this amazing effort. So
I think with their skill, almost like with Blue Point here, that they could take some of these IPs that they've been working on and create an entirely new game. You know, they have that new expansion pack part to the Doom 64 in there with their own levels designed by Kaiser himself.
Yeah, Kaiser himself, SV Kaiser.
Shows that they get these style of games. And I would love to see them, for example, my hopes and dreams are a new Turok game made by Night Dive someday. Yeah.
But I think that's actually the end of this rather long video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed sort of this run through of some of the highlights for us this year. I know I had fun talking about it.
Yeah, thanks, John. It was awesome, man.
But yeah, if you guys enjoyed this, we'll be back in 2021, of course. But we're going to be taking a nice break here shortly, I think. But thanks for watching it, making it all the way to the end. And if you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, follow us on Twitter, all that good stuff. And we will see you next year.